My name is Marcella Ryan Lebeau. I was born at Promise, South Dakota, October 12th, 1919. And my grandmother was a midwife, so I was delivered at home by my grandmother. My grandmother's name was Louise Bareface, and she was from the Hunkpapa tribe from Standing Rock. However, she was enrolled here on Cheyenne River as a member of this tribe, although I know from her history that she is a member from Standing Rock. Her brother was Bareface, and there were a number of brothers, but they all went by a different name. And one of them was Rain in the Face, and he was in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. In fact, at times he was said to have killed Custer, although that has been told both ways, that he did and he didn't. So I don't suppose that the truth will ever be known. And after the Battle of the Little Bighorn, I found out in the history books that they went down up into Canada to get away from the army because I suppose they feared for their lives. They went up into Canada and stayed up there for a while, and I'm not sure how long. And then later on, they were able to come back down to Bismarck on the river, and he made his way back down towards Standing Rock, and he was buried at a Catholic cemetery in Fort Yates, North Dakota. And I was able to go up there and find his grave just a few years ago. I just went there thinking, just looking, because I didn't really know where he was buried. And I was fortunate to find his grave and see the marker, the slab that was on his grave. And it just had his name, Chief Rain in the Face. Then my grandmother, her name was Louise Bareface. And my mother was Flora Forbear. My grandmother was married to Joseph Forbear. He was a chief, and he was one of the ones who signed the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. And I really didn't get to know him because he died in 1909, and I was born in 1919. And I didn't really hear a lot of the history of what had taken place prior to, because it seemed to be that we were supposed to learn the English language and become assimilated. So my parents, my mother and grandmother, they really didn't teach me a whole lot of history. And I think my mother was trying to respect her grandfather's status in life because he was forced to live on the reservation after they signed the peace treaty, and he was given a home, or a home was built for him, and he was forced to live on the reservation and not travel as they had done in the past. And so he settled in the community, which is northeast on the Cheyenne River Reservation, and it became known as Forbear's Camp. So in keeping with that, I think my mother didn't teach us the Lakota language. However, my grandmother didn't speak English, so I was fortunate to be able to learn the Lakota language as a child. And my mother passed away when I was 10 years old, and so I didn't have a whole lot of time with my mother, although the time that I did spend with her was a background for me in a very caring and loving relationship. She was, as I recall, very, very humble, very caring, very compassionate, and she was very kind to us as children. And she did a lot of sewing for us because we were poor, we didn't have much money. And I remember one time she made me a dress, and apparently she didn't have enough fabric to make the complete dress, so she patched it. And in the front she made a design, and she said it resembled a spool of thread. And I didn't like the dress, so I cried because she wanted me to wear it. And my father came along and he explained to me that it resembled a spool of thread. And so when I looked at it in that light, then I no longer disliked the dress, and I was able to wear it and to please my mother. We went to a day school at Promise, and we walked about 2 miles a day to school all year long, wintertime, all through the seasons. And that didn't seem like a hardship to me. In fact, I considered it fun. We went to a little one-room schoolhouse. It had a stove in the middle of the room, and they used wood to heat the room. And I remember there was one family who came to that school. They came in a wagon with like a covered wagon. And I think there were about 13 children in that family, and that came in this team and wagon every day to school. I had 3 brothers and 1 sister. My oldest brother was named Eugene. He was 2 years older than myself. And then my sister, she was 2 years younger than myself. Her name was Johanna. And then I had a brother named Michael William. And my youngest brother was Leo Francis. And we were all 2 years apart. Then when my mother passed away, when I was 10 years old, we went to the boarding school at the old Cheyenne Agency. So after my mother passed away, I became like the mother figure for the family. I did a lot of the cooking and the sewing, the dishwashing, and all of the household duties. And my sister Johanna helped me. And my brother Eugene, he became quite a cook. He used to make us cookies, and they were huge cookies. And one of the cookies, I don't remember what kind they were, but it looked like a sugar cookie. And I had baked these cookies and burnt them on the edge just a little bit. And so my brother Mike, he liked to tease, and he said, cookie looks like that buckskin horse out there. And the buckskin had a black mane and black tail, so he named the horse after my cookie. And he thought that was pretty funny. And my youngest brother Leo was sickly, and when he was a baby he got pneumonia, and I can remember my mother and my dad caring for him when he was sick. In those days we never went to a doctor, and there was a neighbor lady who was she took the place of a doctor. She wasn't a doctor, but they called on her during a time of illness, So she came to the house and looked at him, and they were giving him medication. It must have been aspirin, I'm not sure. But they packed him in ice, and that was what she had suggested. They took wet towels and ice and packed him in ice because he had a fever, and they couldn't break his fever. And it was kind of a saying in those days that if you had pneumonia and you lived through the 9th day, that you would make it. And they walked with him, and I can remember at night they would walk with him when he had a fever, trying to get his fever down and packing him in wet towels. And they really took good care of him, and he did live. However, after he recovered from the pneumonia, he broke out with a lot of boils all over his body, and he was never very well. He seemed to be sickly or ailing, and we took special care of him. We carried him around in a little wagon, and we did a lot of extra little things for him because he wasn't able to do everything for himself. Then my sister Johanna, we learned to do a lot of things as young children living with my dad. We learned to ride horseback. We learned to swim in the river. We learned to dive. We didn't have running water, so we used to, in the spring of the year when we came back from school, we would go to the river and find a spring along the bank of the river, and we would put a barrel in that spring with the top and the bottom out, and that was our drinking water for the summer. We would put that barrel into the spring and clean it all out, and we had a wood cover that we put on top of it. And when we wanted drinking water, we would go down with a pail of water and get it nice and cold and fresh from that spring water. And that was our drinking water for the summer. Then we picked berries, and we made jam and jelly, and we did our own cooking. We had chickens. We had a few head of cattle, and we had horses. And we were quite self-sufficient. We didn't go to town very often because we had the staples right at home there, and we were able to get by with, also we had a milk cow for the milk that we needed. Then we played games. We made up our own games. We played hockey. We went to the timber and we got pieces of wood that were shaped in the form of a hockey stick. And then we would use either a tin can or make up a cloth ball or rubber ball, and we played hockey. And there were other games that we made up ourselves. So we were always occupied. We had a lot of fun among our brothers and sisters. And my oldest brother, he seemed to take care of us and watch out for us. And so we had a lot of fun as children. And I think we looked out for one another. And after my mother passed away, then I guess we were orphans, although we didn't look at ourselves that way, but other people did. And they felt sorry for us. In fact, many of the people who lived up and down the Mara River, they wanted to take us into their homes and keep us. But my dad didn't want us to be separated. He said we should all stay together. And so he never allowed that to happen. But that's always been a good feeling for me because I know that along the Mara River at that time that we had a lot of people who cared for us and we were always their grandchildren, even if we weren't related. So there were many good feelings that we had, even in spite of the fact that we lost our mother. So after that happened, then my dad put us into the boarding school, and I think that was out of necessity that he had to do that because he was a good father and he took good care of us. And he always used to say to us, if your mother were living, she could tell you a lot. And one thing that he impressed upon us was how wonderful my mother was and what a great woman she was. And he always reinforced that so that we knew as young girls that we had a wonderful mother. So we grew up with that feeling. I remember one time when my mother, she became ill, and so she wasn't able to do a lot of things that she wanted to do, and I wanted her to read a book to me. So she was lying down. I took the book and I lay down beside her, and I asked her to read to me. And it was getting dark, and so she said, "My dear," she said, it's too dark to read." And I thought she was reading from the book, so I repeated what she said, thinking that that was what came from the book. Anyway, it's just an example of how caring she was and how she felt about us. So after we went to the boarding school, then all 5 of us went. And I remember the first time I went to the boarding school that apparently I was scared. And when I went to bed that night for the first time, I laid in my bed real straight with my arms down beside me on each side with my legs straight down. And I went to sleep that way, but I didn't feel comfortable at that boarding school. We had long hair, both my sister and I, and they cut our hair short. And they put us in kind of a hickory type dress with black stockings and black stogies, we call them. And it was not a very nice feeling to be at that boarding school among strangers and people that we didn't know. And the first day, I think I cried all day off and on, and no one ever came to find out what the problem was, only my sister. So we eventually got used to the boarding school, and we experienced punishment there, and fortunately I was able to know my own Lakota language and the English language because we were unable to speak the Lakota language at school. And we went to school half a day and we worked half a day. So by the time we had an 8th grade education, we had the equivalent of a 4th grade education. And when we worked for the half day, we worked in the laundry, the kitchen, the dormitories. We scrubbed the floor in the dorms, worked sometimes in the employees' club, and cooked well, not cooked, but we helped with the dishes and the meals and the cleaning. So we did, and also in the sewing room. When I worked in the sewing room, I was able to do a lot of sewing because I had learned at home when my mother passed away, they gave me, or my dad gave me her sewing machine, and he said if I learned to sew that he would buy all the fabric that I needed or wanted. So I did. I made pajamas and I made dresses and designed my own clothes, and And with his encouragement, I was able to do a lot. And one time I made a dress for one of my neighbor girlfriends who came at one time. So with that experience, I was able to do sewing in the sewing room and make sheets and pillowcases. And I was able to put out quite a few sheets and pillowcases because of the past experience I had had with the sewing machine. One thing I think about now is I don't ever remember anyone saying that I did a good job or complimented me on the amount of work that I was able to do. I don't remember that at all. But we were punished for different things, and I don't even remember what we were punished for anymore. But we would walk around on a sidewalk for hours, around and around, by the school, the boys' dorm, the dining room, the girls' dorm, and down into the field and back around again on a sidewalk. And one time, when we were walking around the sidewalk, while we were being punished, we saw the janitor at the school, and he waved to us. So we stopped there to see what he wanted, and he was locked in the school, and he needed his keys from his home. And he was one person who always befriended us and was kind and good to us. He used to give us sticks of gum and spoke to us, and he was a friend of my mother's. And so he said if we could get his keys for him, he told us to go to his house and get them from his wife. So we went around the sidewalk again, and when we came to the place where his wife lived, one of the girls got out of line and she went up to the house to get the keys, and we kept walking around. And when we came back to that spot again, then she fell in with the keys, and we continued on our way till we got to the school again and turned over the keys to him. So we were able to befriend him and return a good deed to him as well. So during the time that I went to the boarding school, we had a lot of experiences, both good and bad. And when we went to class, the teacher would come in and make his assignment, and then he would leave. And after he would leave, then the boys would get out their spitwads and their paper airplanes and start throwing them around. And we had made cards out of construction paper, playing cards. And so we would get out our cards, and so our time would be spent not studying, but doing these other things that we did. So our class period would be spent, and we didn't get much learning done in that way. So we began to tell my dad that we didn't think we were getting a proper education there. And I don't know how we were able to determine that, because we had nothing to compare to, but we had this feeling. So eventually my dad, he moved us to St. Elizabeth's Mission, which was up at Wakmala, South Dakota. And I was in high school by then, and when I was a senior, I was taking classes with the freshmen in order to get enough credits to graduate from high school. And after I graduated from high school, then I wanted to become a nurse. And I went into nurses training at Pierce, South Dakota. And in those days, nurses training was 3 years, and you received a diploma, and that was the highest degree at that time in the field of nursing. Maybe we could cut that off for a while.
You bet. Okay. We're back.
I was talking about the experience at the boarding school, which was at the Old Shine Agency. And all of us went to school there. My oldest brother Eugene, my sister Johanna, my brother Mike, and my brother Leo. I recall having our hair cut, and I didn't think so much of it at the time because I was a child, but I know I cried when it happened. And I think back now how traumatized I must have been in order to cry, but as a child I didn't know more. And so it was devastating to me to have my hair cut. And then they used to fine comb our hair every Saturday and put kerosene on our hair because apparently some of the children had lice. And so that was a routine to have our hair doused with kerosene and have our hair combed with a fine comb, or fine tooth comb, I guess they called it. And the type of clothing we wore was different from what we wore at home. When we went to church on Sunday, we wore a uniform, a blue uniform type, like a sailor collar. And some of the girls were punished when they spoke their own language. They had their mouths washed out with soap. Some of the girls were whipped for doing, I don't know what the act was that they were punished for, but there was a lot of punishment, or it seemed to me that there was. And when I was home, I had never been subjected to any kind of punishment. I was never hit or never punished in any way. And so my first experience with violence was at the boarding school. And I believe that it traumatized us as children. And one of the worst things I believe that can happen to a people is not to be educated properly. And that was, we were being held down by not being educated in the proper way. And so now that I think about it, I feel that was great oppression to keep us from being properly educated. But at the time that I was a child, I didn't think so much of it at that time. And there came a time that I ran away from school. And my dad was one to always tell us that education was important, that we should get a good education, that no one could take that away from us. And so he was telling us some very important things, and as a child, I guess I may not have listened too well, but I realize now what he was trying to tell us, and that with his instructions that we were able to keep education as a priority in our lives. And at one point, I ran away from school. There were two other friends of mine and we ran away from school. And I think we spent one night away from the school, and we were found the next day. And I was glad that they found us, because it was contrary to what my dad was telling me, that we should get a good education and go to school. And so I was going against his instructions. So I was glad that they found us and they took us back to school. I don't recall being punished for it, although I know that others were punished for running away from school. In fact, my oldest brother, he also ran away from school. And some of the treatment that they received was more harsh than the treatment that I received. And I'm not sure about the whole story why he ran away from school, but I know that knowing my brother that there had to be a legitimate reason for him to do that. And he made it home. He made it home, and he was at my uncle's house. And at that time they had boss farmers, and they would send the boss farmer out. So when the boss farmer would show up in his car, my brother would hide. So I'm not sure how long he stayed out of school, but my uncle was willing to protect him and to keep him hidden. So it was a while before he got back to school. And I would like to go back to the time that I had with my grandmother. My grandmother's name was Louise Bareface. And after my mother passed away when I was 10, then I spent a lot of time with my grandmother until she passed away 2 years after that.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that part about the one who died 2 years? Just repeat
Okay.
that part.
Okay, I'll go back to the time that I spent with my grandmother. My grandmother was Louise Bareface. She was from the Standing Rock Reservation. After my mother passed away when I was 10, then I spent a good share of the time with my grandmother until she passed away 2 years after that. And during the time that I had with my grandmother, I learned many things from her. And as a child, I didn't realize how important that time was to me until I became older. But some of the things that I learned from my grandmother was how to pick cherries. We'd go out in the woods and pick cherries, and I would help her prepare the cherry patties and to dry. And we would put them on a piece of white gauze on a screen, and we'd take that screen after it was filled with the cherries and put it up on a roof to dry, and we would cover them with another cheesecloth to keep the insects off until they were able to dry. We would go back and turn them until they dried on both sides. And after they were dry, then she would put them into tin cans and pack them away for the winter time. And she was a very industrious, hardworking lady. I helped her with preparing corn. We'd husk the corn and take the kernels of corn off the cob and dry those. And we do the same thing, put the corn on a piece of white gauze and put it on a screen to dry. And then after it was dry, then she would store it away in a sack or put it away for the winter. And then also she made hominy out of corn, and I was able to help her do that. She would boil the corn and use lye and ashes and work the corn until all the hulls were off. And that was after it was all prepared, then she stored that also for the winter. And then I was able to help her with drying meat. And I can see her yet how she would take the meat and put it on her forearm and take a knife and just cut that in very thin layers and spread it out. And she would take green twigs from a tree and put them in the meats to hold it open and apart, and then hang those up over a clothesline wire. And then she would make a smudge out of green leaves and branches so that the mosquitoes and insects wouldn't bother the meat while it was drying. And she did a lot of work in preparing food for the winter. And she was an exceptionally clean person. And I can remember her when she would bake bread. She would have a certain pan, aluminum pan that she would use for baking bread. And that was the only thing she ever used that pan for. And she'd clean it up and hang it back on the wall again. And so I remember how clean and that she did her work, and how she hauled water. And I was able to help her with all of these things, and I really learned a lot. And there were certain roots and herbs that she used, but unfortunately I was too young to realize the significance of the knowledge that she had in using those different roots and herbs for different purposes. And so I don't remember a lot of what she would have been able to teach me had I been a little older and known the significance of the knowledge that she had. And now that I think back, I think of her as having wisdom far beyond book knowledge, and wisdom far beyond anything that is written in books. And I think of the time at the boarding school when we read in the books that our people were savage, they were dirty, they were uneducated, and all of these negative things that were written in the books about our people. But somehow that didn't affect me, because I knew my grandmother and my mother, and I knew how they were, and I knew how they lived, and how clean and how industrious they were. So those negative comments that were written in books didn't affect me in my life. And I'm so grateful for having had that period of time that I was able to spend with my grandmother, and all the wonderful things that she did for me. I recall one time as a child, I was at her house. She had a fireplace, and she put down a robe, a buffalo robe, in front of the fireplace, and made me a place to sleep. Got me a pillow and a cover so I could sleep there that night. I remember seeing the coals and the fire, how nice and rosy they were, and how comforting that was. My grandmother would take me, put her arm around my shoulder, and she would say, "Mitrakoja." And somehow the meaning of that has more meaning than calling you by your own personal name. And I think that's one of the things that is missing in our society today, is not having a grandmother to comfort you and to just say, "Mitrakoja." And to me, there's a lot of meaning in that, and it's very comforting to know that you're loved in that way. So we'll cut. Wait just a minute.
Oh, sure. Okay, we're back.
Okay. I'd like to share a story about my great-grandfather. His name was Joseph Forbear, and he was a chief. He was of the Two Kettle Band. When he was young, the story is told that he was one of the Fool Soldiers band. And as young men, they organized themselves to do good and noble deeds. And it's told that even their own people were opposed to them doing that because of the environment at that time. That was back in 1862, and there were, it was a warrior type situation. And so these young men, they had Martin Charger as their leader. They organized themselves, and when the Minnesota Uprising happened in 1862, the Santee Sioux, White Lodge being their chief, took captive some white women and children from the Lake Chautauqua area in Minnesota. And they took them to a place up by Mobridge near the Grand River. And they were holding them there as captives. When my great-grandfather and Martin Charger heard about this, they organized themselves and decided that this was one thing that they could do that would be a good thing, to rescue these white women and children and return them to their relatives. So they began by gathering together their horses and blankets and other goods. And the story says that they crossed the Missouri River someplace down around what is now Fort Pierre. And the Missouri River is a treacherous river, but they swam their horses and their goods and swam the river and went across to the other side. And they shone a mirror back to their people on the other side to let them know that they made it across and were on their way. So they went up the east bank of the Missouri River to Chief White Lodge's camp, and they negotiated the return of these white women and children. And the story says that they negotiated for the return of each one, and they would offer goods, and when the exchange was made, that person would go over to their side of the tent. And this continued until there was one person left, and that was Mrs. Dooley. And apparently White Lodge wasn't willing to part with her. And so White Lodge's son came into the picture, and he spoke to his dad and telling him to turn her over to the Fool Soldiers band. And so that came to be that he did, in fact, part with Mrs. Dooley. And they began their trip back down the east side of the Missouri River. And apparently on the way, a storm broke out, a winter storm. And the women and children were dressed very scantily. So the story says that Martin Charger took off his moccasins and gave them to one of the women, and he wrapped his own feet in cloth. And Pretty Bear carried one of the children on his back. So they made their way down in this winter storm, and one night they found a place to stay, and they marched around that tent or wherever they were housed all night long, so that the White Lodge wouldn't catch up with them, and they would protect the women and children. So they stayed awake all night long and walked around the tent to protect these women and children. So eventually they returned them to their, down toward Fort Pierre, and they turned them over to a man by the name of Dupree and LaPlante, and eventually they were returned to their relatives. And I found a letter over at the Cheyenne River tribal office at one point, and it was written by my mother. And my mother said in the letter that her grandfather was Chief Joseph Forebear, and that he was one of the Fool Soldiers band. And that was my connection with the story. I hadn't heard the story before until I found this letter that my mother had written. And it tells in there where her grandfather didn't so much as dance Indian till the day he died, after he signed the peace treaty. And that really affected me to read that sentence. Because to me, if you can't be who you are, then who are you? And it's like cultural genocide. If you can't live your life the way you are and who you are. And so he lived out his life at Forebear's camp, and he passed away in 1909. Okay, that's all I tell about that now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Would you like me to ask about some of these questions?
Okay.
Okay. Maybe you can share some of the values that your mother or your grandmother taught, some of the teachings about respect, or, you know, one of the different values that was really important to them.
It's I guess I was a child, you know, when growing up, and I never thought that much about it. And I guess thinking back, it's kind of being in an environment of a comforting environment where you knew you were safe, that you were being cared for, all your needs were met, and it was a happy environment, and we were allowed to be children, and we were respected, and we never heard harsh words or any type of violence, or it was just a good place to be. We had a grandfather who was not my real grandfather. My grandmother had remarried, and so he became our grandfather, and his name was Eagle Boy, but he was very kind and good to us, and he was the only grandfather we knew, and we learned to love him. And he used to come to visit us, and we would cook for him. And as children, I'm sure that we cooked, what we cooked wasn't all that great, but he was very appreciative of everything that we made, and he bragged us up for the food that we fixed for him. And we were always willing to do that, to see that he had something to eat, and we gave him coffee. And he would sit and tell us stories. We'd sit on the ground, and he would tell us different stories. And he couldn't speak English either, but we were able to communicate because we learned, as children, we learned the Lakota language. So we had a real good relationship with him as well. And he was especially good to my older brother. He had given him land, and he had given him horses, and he it just seemed to me that the oldest one in the family, especially if he was a male, that they were more attention was paid to them. In fact, when my brother went to college, my grandfather was writing to him in Lakota, and my brother would respond to him in the same way. And so they had a real good relationship in that way. Okay.
And so how did your parents or grandparents demonstrate sadness if there was a loss or a difficult time? How did they keep their family's morale high during those difficult times?
I think back about one time when we had a tornado. It was in the early afternoon, and the sky became dark, and we didn't know what was happening, but a tornado came by, and it took the chicken coop, and it took the barn, and some of the corrals. And the house was remained okay. There was a frame house and a log house, and they were okay. But we lost, my grandmother lost chickens, and they lost, I think, a cow. And I can imagine that was a difficult time for my grandparents, although we never knew it as children, because they never reacted in any way that I could see anyway. So they were able to endure that without, or just take it in stride. Okay.
And so what kind of special things made your grandparents and your parents feel happiness?
Well, for my grandmother, I think being around her grandchildren was a great source of happiness, although she was a very humble and quiet woman, and didn't have outbursts of emotion, although it was a quiet sort of happiness or contentment, or maybe nowadays we call it serenity. And she had what I consider a lot of serenity. She was able to conduct herself in her environment in a very nice, quiet way, which nowadays we call serenity, or I call serenity.
And so they taught about inila, or quietness. That was one of the qualities of the people. And so did you learn about quietness? Are there any stories you could share about that?
Not really.
The people were quiet in kind of a natural way, a way of showing respect, especially children toward adults.
That's right. It just happened. We didn't think about it as happening, but it just was, or
And so, what did they teach you about helping one another? They lived to help one another.
I can recall at my grandmother's place that people came by to visit or passing on their way through to another area, and they would camp near their home there, and she would always have something for them to eat. Uh, she had a wood stove, and there was always food cooked up on the stove, and there was always coffee and something to eat. And always, they were made to feel welcome, that there was always food for them, and it was available to them. My mother and my grandmother were very generous people, and they saw to it that anyone who came by their homes was offered food and coffee and a place to sleep, and it was just part of the way they lived. They were very generous.
Maybe you can describe what it was like to be at the old agency. Do you remember being down there when you were a young child? What camp was like there? What your home looked like?
I really didn't have any experience in the old agency as such, except at the boarding school.
You didn't live close to the did you live as a small child in the camp that was the Four Bears camp?
No, I lived at Promise. Which is about 20 miles from there, along the river. In fact, my dad built our home.
You had a frame house or log house?
We had a log house, and our house was built by my father, and he cut the logs down, sawed them down, and he laid them out in the open on top of a block, or so that it was up off the ground, and he would turn those ever so often so that they dried evenly, and they didn't warp, or they were all nice straight logs. And out of these logs then he built our home. He built a two-room house with a large attic. And everything he did was very neat and clean, and he took great pride in his work, and he was a hard worker. And my sister and I, we had a room up in the attic part, which was a nice large area. And my family lived in the 2 rooms downstairs. One was a bedroom, and one was a kitchen and dining room combined. We had a stairway, and we thought that was pretty nice. And later on, he built a garage onto the house, and we thought we were living in a mansion because our house was comfortable. In the wintertime, it was warm. In the summertime, it was cool. And so we thought we lived in a mansion. And although we weren't rich, we had a lot of wealth in other ways, and we lived in a happy home, happy environment.
Mm-hmm. And so how did they show their respect for others, and how did they honor their family and other people?
I can't think of any examples right off, but it was just a way of living, and how you dealt with other people, and how you respected them, and you're just, I can't think of any example exactly that would bring that out, but it was just a manner of living, and how you treated people, and how people in return treated you.
Who was the elder outside your family that had the most positive influence on your life? And how was it that they helped you?
Outside of my family?
Uh-huh. Kind of like a non-family member.
Well, probably my grandmother outside my immediate family. And I shared, my experiences with her. I was asked to be a grandmother in a film, and it was about FAS, FAE, and something is blinking there.
Oh, hold on. I bet my battery's going low.
I was asked to be the grandmother in a film that was done on FAS and FAE, and to give advice to the young children. And one of the things that I said to them was to choose a path in their life to follow and to be happy and to share their happiness with others and to respect the earth that we walked upon and the sky, the air that we breathed, the plants, the herbs and the roots and the animals, to respect all being. And by doing so, that same would return to a person. And I think about our environment here on Cheyenne River, and it makes me really feel sad to think that many of our children do not have the same opportunity that I had when I was growing up. And even for the fact that I lost my mother at age 10 and my grandmother at age 12, that I had been in a loving and caring environment, a nonviolent environment, for the time that I had with them. And those feelings and that way of life helped me in my lifetime. And I feel sad that many of the children do not have the same type of family. I was just saying that I feel sad that many of the children living on the Cheyenne River Reservation do not have the same type of home environment that I had when I was growing up. And we have a lot of alcoholism, drug abuse, and a lot of negative things happening in our environment. And I served as a nurse for 31 years before I retired, and I knew firsthand some of the problems that existed on our reservation, and wish that somehow that could be changed. Many of the things that happened were alcohol related. And alcohol is not one of our traditions. It's not a traditional way of life. And if somehow we can deal with that problem, it could turn our reservation around so that maybe the time would come when our children could grow up in a caring, loving environment away from alcoholism and the detrimental effects that alcoholism has on a family.
Mm-hmm. And so what advice do you have for the parents today?
I guess my advice would be to live a sober, alcohol and drug-free life. And even nowadays, we know that smoking has very devastating effects on people, and to limit their smoking to ceremonial type events. And if we could go back to the way that our grandparents lived, it would change a lot on our reservation. And these children could grow up with a sense of well-being and a good self-esteem, and be ready to meet all the challenges in our life.
So you referred earlier to the traditional ways of disciplining the child had no harshness, no punishment to it. And so maybe you could share with some of today's parents and the young people what the goodness of the old ways of raising and disciplining the child.
That's true. My parents, my grandparents especially, they were very, very kind and caring, and they seemed to guide a person rather than to use harsh discipline. And I don't recall ever seeing my grandparents spank anyone or discipline them harshly. It was always in a kind and gentle way. And I believe that children can be guided in that way if there is love in that environment.
So how can we help a young person who may have done wrong?
It's my feeling that if a wrong has been committed, if that child is allowed to right that wrong, or to make restitution in some way, or to pay for the wrong that they did, that more likely they will not repeat that same thing again, or commit a greater crime if they aren't stopped the first time. And children need guidance, and I believe that it can help children to let them see the wrong that has been done, and then have them pay back whatever the wrong was done, or whatever, make them repay somehow.
And so what traditional values that were always among our people can help today's people overcome these addictions, such as alcohol, drugs, even gambling addictions?
I'm of the opinion that our time is valuable, our time is precious, and how we use our time tells the type of person we are and how we value that time. And we can use our time in productive kinds of ways, and by volunteering to help someone else, or making life easier for someone else, or donating your time to make something easier in your community or for someone else. When our time is taken up in good ways, in productive ways, we don't have time for the addictions of alcoholism, drugs, smoking, gambling, bingo, and all of the negative influences that have changed our environment for in a negative way. We can turn that around and do positive things one for another and make change on our reservation that would benefit all of the people, the elderly, the youth, and everyone living on our reservation.
Maybe you could spend just a minute talking about all the volunteer work you are involved with, the committees you serve on, the boards, and give people an idea of the different things they could do to contribute to their community. Not just right now, but even in the past when you've contributed.
Living in Eagle Butte on the Cheyenne River Reservation, I have volunteered a lot of my time because I like to help people. And after I retired from nursing, I have been involved with the North American Indian Women's Association, which is an organization that was organized back in 1970 in Boulder, Colorado. And I have attended every conference since that time except one that was held in Phoenix, Arizona. And I've held several offices and was president at one time of the North American Indian Women's Association. And here in the local community, we organized a group back in about 1970, and we have been doing things in the community for other people, such as giving Christmas baskets for the less fortunate at Christmas time. We have raised money to help in different ways. More lately, we have had collected quotes to give out for the people in the wintertime, the ones who don't have coats for their children. And we have had poster contests to against smoking, against alcoholism, and about diabetes, and some of the major things that have been affecting our people on Cheyenne River. Then I belong to the Gray Eagle Society, which is one of many Gray Eagle societies. There's one on Cheyenne River, one on Pine Ridge, one on Rosebud, and one in Standing Rock. And our main interest is the Black Hills. And we have a bill that was written to get the unoccupied lands back. And so far, nothing is happening on that bill right now. But we had an attorney, Mario Gonzalez, who wrote that bill. And so at some point in time, we may try to do something about that again. And then right now I'm serving as a secretary for the Cheyenne River Wounded Knee Survivors Association. And although I'm not a direct descendant of the Wounded Knee, I offered to help because I saw that there was a need there. And one of the things that we're trying to do right now is to get a Ghost Stand shirt back from Glasgow, Scotland. And although there isn't much happening on that right now, we made one trip to Glasgow, Scotland to make our plea, and we will attempt again to request for that back. And at the same place they have a beaded vest that belongs to my grandfather, Rain in the Face, and also I have talked to them about that. So that's some of the volunteer work that I have been doing. Then on diabetes, we had a diabetes support group here in this community. And occasionally we get a speaker or we have meetings just to support one another. And diabetes is one of our major diseases here on this reservation. In fact, it's at epidemic proportions, and I think it's important to try to, help one another. Although I'm not a diabetic myself, I think it's important to help the people who are diabetic. And I'm currently a volunteer for AARP, which is for retired people, and I'm working in the health advocacy field in that group. And I was asked to be the advisor for the seventh generation, which was a youth group, and they have disbanded right now. But I'm interested in helping the youth in whatever they choose to do to try to better themselves or make Cheyenne River a better place for them.
Mm-hmm. I just have one last question. What traditional values can be brought back to help the people overcome those addictions and the cycles of abuse? The verbal, the physical, emotional, sexual abuse that is on the reservation. What values can be retaught to the people that can help them to overcome that?
Well, I think the main thing is that all of these things that you mentioned are not traditional. They're from another culture. And one of the things that I used to say when I worked, that the young people haven't retained enough from their own culture that was good, and they haven't picked up enough from the non-Indian culture that was good, and they were drifting between cultures. And we had a lot of problems with the youth for that reason. And I think going back to the traditional values in that lifestyle, that it would certainly help to eliminate the drug abuse, the alcoholism, and all of the negative things that are creating problems for the youth today.
My name is Shirley Keith, and I am the granddaughter of Chief White Swan of the Mnekoju of the Cheyenne River Reservation. And my father is James Hart Swan, and my mother's name is Lucy High Pine Swan. And my grandmother's name is Julia Brave Eagle from the Rosebud Sioux Reservation. And my grandfather's name was Thomas High Pine from the Rosebud Sioux Reservation. I was born on the Cheyenne River Reservation in 1934. And I'm married to Sidney John Keith, and we had 8 children, 2 boys and 6 girls, and they're all grown up and have their own families, and we reside here in Rapid City. We have been here for about 11 years. And as far as I can remember, I was taught a lot of things by both my grandparents and my parents. And I teach my children the same values that they have taught me. And one of the things that they have taught me was to live by the 4 values of the tradition, which is a tradition with the Lakota people, which is bravery, generosity, wisdom, and fortitude. And she said to always live by them. And so that's what I teach my children and my grandchildren. And I have been taught a lot of things by my grandmother, Grandma Julia Brave Eagle, High Pine. She taught me a lot of things too, and to even sing. And so I did a lot of singing in my time, and my mother did sing a lot too of the traditional songs, the honor songs, and so I did that too, sang honor songs for people, and in turn I taught my 2 daughters, so they sing now, and now I can't hardly sing. I don't have the stomach muscles to carry a high-pitched voice, and so I don't hardly do that anymore, and it's kind of sad to not be able to do that anymore. And there are a lot of things that I taught my grandchildren. I taught them the values, and to try to live by them, and to get in touch with their higher power, the Great Spirit. And so my grandchildren have sun danced, and so have all my children. And I've taught them respect, and there's times that I see things that they have done, and I would correct them and tell them that that wasn't the right way to do things, that they have respect for the people around them, and so they're learning, and in return my grandchildren have respect for me, and they come over and ask me questions if if what they're doing is right and all that. And so I tell them things. I still tell them things and try to help them with their learning in the traditional ways. And my husband and I have been really helpful in this community with prayers and ceremonies. He did ceremonies, and so we were really helping the people here in our community of Rapid City. the children nowadays need to really learn to respect. And if they do that, then I think they would be on the right road to help themselves and find their identity. And we need a lot of that in the schools, which should have been done long time ago when they were in the early grades. But that was just introduced into the schools not too long ago. So we had to, we were oppressed for so long through the boarding schools, but we found our way back and on our own, and that's why we're trying to teach our young children that the values and the way of life that we lived and our grandparents and parents lived in. And like the word inila, which is quiet, my grandparents taught us that, and then that was why the people long ago didn't have too many children, because of their constant moving from the enemy, and you couldn't have too many children and to keep them quiet, and that's how they taught us how to keep quiet and to respect people, and to not to say anything unless if you thought you were worthy to say anything to the other person. And if you didn't think that you were worthy of that, then you don't say anything. You just keep quiet and listen. And there was a lot of times that joyous times that we spent together as Lakota people, with our dances and our parades, morning charge and all that. That was really practiced clear into the I think it was early 1949, if I could remember. That was still practiced in Cherry Creek. We had morning charges at our powwows, and everything was traditional, and that was a good feeling. And I grew up in that way till in 1949, I think. And after that, we never had any of those things. Most of the elderly people have gone on to the spirit world, and it seems like they took these things with them. The older people tell us, and I believe that to be true, because some of those things aren't practiced anymore and done in these communities. Now everything is so commercialized, and all these dancing for money, and that's the only way these singers even sing anymore. These traditional ways is to get paid. And if we could only have these things back into the traditional way of life to show our children that's the way we lived long time ago, I'm sure that would really help them to appreciate more of the things that they take for granted from their grandparents and their parents. But that is so much needed in this generation that we're living in now. And the main thing would be to try to teach them their native language, and some of the youth too. They come and they want to know if I could teach them take time out and teach them the language, and that they would like to learn the language. And so I've been doing that and teaching my own children the language, and in turn, my daughter's teaching her children the language, and so they pretty well understand the language. If we talk to them, why they understand, but they still can't hardly talk it. But we're trying to preserve the language in our own family, and for people that come to me to learn the language. And I started school at the mission school when I was in the 3rd grade, and I was left there till I was in the 10th grade. So I practically grew up in the Catholic Church, and I think that really helped in my life now, because I am a strong Catholic woman, and I tried to bring my whole family into that too. And I am Catholic, and I practice that, and then I do the traditional ceremonies and all that. I mean, I attend them, and Sundances and all that, and so I have both of them in my life, and that's what I try to teach my children, to bring them back into their faith, and to get in touch with their with the Lord, and to live that life too. And so and as I was growing up, during the vacation time that I had, we did a lot of things. We did a lot of swimming and picking berries, and I guess more or less we had to help with picking up cherries and all the things to get ready for the winter for my family. And we were taught to do that, and of course we had good times with playing with other children too, and everything was always good. We never were doing anything that was out of the way, because my grandmother told me that she said, granddaughter, she said, your higher power is always watching you. He's always watching over you, and anything you do, even if people don't see you, he sees you, and you have to remember that, she told me, and I always kept that in mind. But I learned that in school too, at the mission school. So that's what I teach my grandchildren too, that the Lord has charge of your life. The Great Spirit has charge of your life, and everything you do, he knows, I told him. And to always give thanks and not to ask for things, because I said, he knows what your needs are, and so never ask for anything. Just give him thanks for everything that you have, and even for your health, I told him. And we had, when we played in our days, we just played with dolls, and anymore these days, these children, they don't think about playing with dolls. And my mom made a little 4-wall tent for us, so we always played in that, and we had little wagons to play with, and we were like moving all the time into different camps. We'd take our little tent down, and we had a lot of fun with children our age, and nothing that's the children do nowadays. We never had all that, and I always teach that to my grandchildren. I said, you ought to be happy and with what you have now and appreciate it. I said, when we were growing up, we never had all these things. We had to do with what we had. We played with bones, I said, for cars and for toys, I said, and we played on the hillside and made mud pies, and that's what we played. I said, and it was a lot of fun for us. I said, we never had all these things that you kids have now, movies and all the fun things you get to do now. We never grew up with that, but we were satisfied with the way of life that we lived, and we appreciate it. I have two sons, and one of my sons, Johnny Ray Keith was his name, and when he was 4 months old, he got seriously ill, and they couldn't find out what was really wrong with him, and by the time they did all the tests and found out what he had, well, he was pretty sick, and he never came out of it, and he was an invalid for life, I guess, and the doctor told me that he would live to be 16 years old, and so I prayed for him, and here he lived to be 18 years old when he passed away, and I couldn't accept the fact that why me, Lord, I would think, and because of my faith and my prayers, why, this happened, and then finally one day I realized that, well, here the doctor told me he'd live to be 16 years old, and here he lived to be 18 years old. So, well, maybe my higher power, my great spirit, is trying to tell me something or show me something, and he put him on this earth to show me something, and maybe that was it, to get back in touch with my Lord, and to live that life again. So that's when I came back into the church and start living this life, spiritual life again, back into the church and prayers. And we have to persevere in prayer. We don't just pray one day and forget about it the next day. We have to persevere in prayer, and in that way we will be closer to the Great Spirit. And that's the way I believe, and that's the way the Bible teaches us. And the Lord teaches that to us too, that we need to learn to pray and to persevere in prayer. And that's what I tell my grandchildren. My granddaughter, Jody, I've talked to her, and she listens, and I teach her these things, and some of my other granddaughters too, they come here and they visit me, and I talk to them about things like that, and so they're all really spiritual, some of my grandchildren, but some of my grandchildren are still out there. They need to come back into the spiritual way of life, and I'm still praying for them that someday that they come back on this road. Today it's really nice to see that the churches accept the Lakota spiritual way of life and they practice some of the ceremonies in the church, and they've accepted that in the churches today, and so that gives me a good feeling, and I'm sure to the other Lakotas that this is being done and practiced both ways in the church, and either way, we have to be spiritually minded and get in touch with the Great Spirit. One way or another, we can practice both ways, the traditional way of life, the spiritual way, and the Catholic way of talking to our God, because we pray to the same God in both languages, and that way we get closer to God. To me, that's my way of believing, and I'm sure other people believe that way too. And that too, I teach my children and my grandchildren that. My one thing that my parents told us children, that was when my oldest brother Manuel was 10 years old. Well, they lived with my father's uncle. Grandpa puts on his shoes. Charlie puts on his shoes at Red Elm while he was talking, and he said to my my brother, he was petting him, and he told him that he was going to live in a crazy society, and that he felt sorry for him and felt bad. But he said, grandson, he said, be strong and be brave, and because only the people that are of sound mind and walk with the pipe are the ones that are going to survive. And my oldest brother was an alcoholic, and he died in he was 65 years old when he died, and he died while he was in treatment. And he died from something that was related to his alcoholism, and so he lived part of that life, because in the 50s, I think, or the early 60s was when all these drugs came into in this society, and people were using it, but I don't think it was really used that much on the Cheyenne River Reservation as it is now, but alcohol was. And that was the worst thing that ever happened to the Lakota people, was when they opened up the alcohol in 1950, I think it was, or
52.
Yeah, 52 was when they opened up the use of alcohol to the Indians. And that, I think, was the worst thing that they ever did to the Lakota people. I'm sure if they didn't do that then, well, maybe we could control the use of alcohol and drugs from our children, grandchildren now. And I strongly believe that that could have saved our youth today, and the children that are growing up yet, and all these violence we have in our own society. But that was kind of a prophecy that my grandpa told my brother, and my parents told us that, and to remember that. There was things that my mother told me and my grandmother told me that all these things. Like there was one thing that they told us, and I never believed it. I heard it from them, but I never really believed it. And then later on, some of those things that I experienced and they happened. And so I guess we should listen to our great grandparents and our grandparents and learn and try to listen to what they tell us now, and maybe this society will be a much better place for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren to live. Maybe there's still a way that we can teach them that. And like the children have pure hearts, and they have the Great Spirit shows them and can show them visions that some of us elders can't even see, because that was another thing that my mother told me, that the children were sacred. And there was a saying that she said to me not to ever say Michingshi or Michungshi. That means my son and my daughter are really in Indian it says Michingshi Tewachila, Michungshi Tewachila. Never to say that, but always say Michingshi, Michungshi Oshiwakila. To always say Oshilaka, never say that Tewachila, because that's saying, you know, she said the Great Spirit gave us these children. That was the gift from Him to us, and that we have to love these children and really take care of them, or He could take them back just like that. And I think that in my brother's time, I think that's what happened to him, because he too was an alcoholic, and he one day his little girl was really ill, and his wife was taking care of him, and we told her to take her to the hospital, and here she said, no, she said, I'll wait till my Erskine gets back, and and so she waited. And by the time they got her to the hospital, she had pneumonia and she didn't make it. And this happened just before Christmas, but and I think he was trying to show him something there, because when they were drinking, why they would always, his wife would give his little girl back to him, and I took care of my little niece a lot, because my brother couldn't take care of her, so that happened a lot, and to me, I think that was what was shown to them then. But in time, they did separate, and then didn't live together after that, after their little girl had gone back to the spirit world. They had a beautiful child, and that was the only. Oh well, he did have another boy in his second marriage, and he's still alive, and his parents are both gone, but he's still alive. But like I said, we have to really live a spiritual life And that's the way the a long time ago Indians lived. That was the way of life that they lived, and it was always for the Great Spirit. They had the Great Spirit in their lives, and to guide them through all these things. And to me, I think that's the way that the Lord would want everybody to live. And maybe that's why all these things are happening. And these are told in the Bible, too, that these things are going to happen. And to me, I think we're nearing the end of the world, the way all these things are shown to us. And maybe he's trying to tell the people that to change their ways. Nowadays, everybody lives for money, I guess, their love for money. If you use the money the right way that was intended for, well then that's all right. But some of them, they use it. They're really in love with money, and money is their God, and it shouldn't be that way. So we need to focus on our spirituality a lot more than we have, I guess. And
Are there any other family stories you'd like to share? Things.
my husband and I started, he started with Grandpa Fool's Crow and Matthew King, the first Sundance in Greengrass in 1970, and he has been director of that for 26 years. He was director of that. And every year about this time, early August, we would get ready for that, and we would have the Sundance for the people to come together, which was called International Sundance, and people from all over, all Lakotas came to that. We never let any non-Indian dance at our Sundance, and today it's still practiced that way. They haven't changed anything. It's the same way that we had it in 1970, and so now that my husband is gone, we still have that. We're going to have that again this year, and we come together in a good way, and I know that it's strong, and our prayers are strong, because there's times that we have a hard time, but we must pray hard enough, because everything comes together, and I know our prayers are strong, because I had one experience there that I know that our prayers are strong if it comes from our heart. And everybody that's there, I think they make their pledges, and it's between them and the Tonkashla that they're there, and it comes from their heart. They're there to give thanks every year, and people go there and they dance 4 years, and some of them come back the 5th year, and some of them are still there from the first time that they danced, and they're still there, and they keep coming back, and that's the way of giving thanks to their Tonkashla, the Great Spirit, too, and they really believe in that way. My husband was always helping people in this community, non-Indians and Indians. He never had anything to say to anybody. I think everything was always good. He treated everybody alike. He And there was people that called him about things that happened in their lives, and so he would help them and guide them in the right direction. Like some people would see things even during the day that they couldn't believe why it was happening, and so he would always tell them that to get in touch with their higher power and to have go the spiritual way and believe in it, and he would always tell them to have a crucifix in their house and pray, and then would tell them that if these things didn't work, well, then to get in touch with him again, and so they never did call back again, but they did call back and thank him for them helping them, and he was always, people come to him for counseling. He was like a counselor to people too. And they would always call him through the phone, or they'd come and see him, and he'd give them guidance through the phone, or they would come to see him in person. And there was one girl I remember from Spearfish that he was seeing him when he passed away, and I don't know, she was coming back. He was counseling her, and she didn't know he was ill, and then he passed away, and she didn't know, so she came after he had gone back to the spirit world, and she came to see him for counseling again, and she was really sad because she said that she never heard of his passing, and she didn't live very far from here, but I don't know why she didn't hear of his passing on to the spirit world. But he was really, he touched a lot of hearts, and people were always calling me and telling me that they never heard of his passing, and but he's helped a lot of people in his life, and I'm sure the Great Spirit, through the Great Spirit, all these things he did came through him, because he was always really spiritual, and it was through the Great Spirit that he can do these things, and he always said that. And all these ceremonies he did, and his prayers and everything was always for him, and he always told the people that it was through him that he can do these things, and that to have the faith in him, and that he would always be there to help them too. But all his ceremonies were always through him. He always told the people that. And maybe it was time that the Lord thought that he put him on this earth for that reason, maybe. And maybe he accomplished what he wanted him to do. And for a long time I couldn't accept that. Too, and finally I accepted that too, that the Lord was good enough to give us 47 years together, which was a blessing for us. And it is really hard to live by myself, but I'm trying, and through the Great Spirit and my Lord, I think I've come a long ways. This is my picture of my mother, Lucy J. Swan, who has a lot of influence in my life and my children and some of my grandchildren that lived to see her. She died in 1981. My son graduated in that year, and she barely lived to see him graduate. And when she graduated, she had a ceremony for him in Cherry Creek, and she was in a wheelchair, and she gave him a war bonnet because he had earned it by graduating from the South Dakota State University of Wilkins University. A long time ago, you can wear a war bonnet if you earned it, and I thought that, and that's what she had. She said she would do if he ever graduated from college, and he did from the State University of Wilkins.